All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started on time. I'm Sana Al-Khatib. I'm an electrophysiologist at Duke University Medical Center, and I have the pleasure and privilege of moderating this session with an esteemed panel of discussants here. The title of this session is AI-aided remote interventions. Will this transform healthcare delivery and outcomes? Very important question. So before we start, though, I'd like people to start by introducing yourself, please, and just tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you've done specifically related to AI and or remote interventions. So starting with you, please.
Oh, hi. My name is Livio Klein. I'm from UCSF. I'm the section chief for advanced heart failure and transplant. I have dual training in heart failure and electrophysiology, and my passion and research has been in devices for the last 15 years. I manage the heart failure device clinic, and I've started two companies actually. One developing a non-invasive sensor for heart failure, and the second company developing AI to treat cardiovascular disease.
Great, thank you. Thank you for being here. Please.
Hi, I'm Rob Kazmersky. I'm a team lead for the hemodynamic and heart failure diagnostics team within the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at FDA. And for cardiac devices, we split diagnostics into more or less anything that measures heart rhythm and rate and everything else. And so my team gets the everything else. We do see a lot of AI-driven diagnostic devices coming our way, and we're excited to see where it goes.
Great, welcome.
Hi, my name is Sonal Chandra. Thank you for having me. I'm a medical director at GE. My background is I spent 20 years in academic medicine in Chicago, and my specialty is multimodality imaging and prevention, as well as my expertise is in clinical drug development. At GE, I'm responsible for leading charge for ECG-based solutions, innovation in ECG-based solutions, including AI. And I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Welcome, thank you.
I'm Noemi Ray with PaceMate. We are a digital health platform for CID remote monitoring, and we work on improving workflows, automated workflows for CIDs and ambulatory devices and pretty much anything cardiac in our platform. And we also have a service division as well as part of our platform.
Welcome.
My name is Bimal Shah. I'm a non-invasive cardiologist and a recovering academic clinician. More recently, I was the chief medical officer at Livongo and then at Teladoc, where we had a number of remote monitoring solutions for people with chronic conditions. And we used AI and machine learning to personalize our content engine, as well as motivate engagement. More recently, I spent a lot of time advising a number of companies on their device strategy, their services strategy, as well as a venture partner for an East Coast-based venture firm.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi, I'm Arnaud Rosier. I'm a cardiac electrophysiologist for France. Thanks for having me. It's quite a group. My background is I have a PhD in computer science, so I've been working especially on old-fashioned AI, such as expert systems and knowledge-based solutions. And I run Implicity, which is a digital medtech providing a remote monitoring platform, agnostic and universal, which encompass some AI components. So we've been in the last 2 years having some specific machine learning algorithms that are triaging data approved by FDA and included in this platform that is available in the US as well.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Sandra Nagli. I'm at Boston Scientific. I've been at the company for 17 years. I started out as a scientist, PhD scientist, and then many years later, I'm working in IT and leading digital health and AI in healthcare. So technology expert and aficionado. I've been following a lot of different technologies that have been helping healthcare advance, and I'm extremely excited about turning, and moving our company forward when it comes to a company that's been remote patient monitoring for decades, and then moving into applying AI and again, affecting patients' lives in the right ways in the future.
Great. So as you can see here, we have abundant expertise and great experiences that we all will learn from. Just as a reminder, please submit your questions through the app. We'd love to get your questions as well, and we want to try to keep this as interactive as possible and trying to focus it on solutions as well. So let me start with the first question. Before we get to will this transform healthcare delivery and outcomes, can you give us examples of AI-aided remote interventions, your experiences with those potential interventions before we even talk about their potential impact?
I mean, there's not that many, right? I think AI has been touted as the greatest solution for medicine, but so far we've only seen that in aiding diagnosis and maybe prognosis, but not truly interventions. So what we've applied, we've developed an algorithm, for instance, to optimize the guideline-directed medical therapy, GDMT, for heart failure, where essentially we know that we have a huge problem. Only less than 10% of the patients are optimized, and all the problems with healthcare. So can you have an AI sort of scrub the EMR every day, identify opportunities, and then present that as a clinical decision support system to the nurse practitioners and physicians to optimize the treatment? So we've grown, we've increased actually the GDMT titration from about 10% to 50% within 6 months with that just very simple intervention.
That's a great example. Can you tell us if these results have been replicated in other practices, or what your next steps might be? You may be planning to do that.
Exactly. So the next step is to replicate outside, UCSF to other practices, not necessarily academic practices, or maybe health integrated systems.
But that's such an important area of focus, so thank you for sharing that with us. Any other examples from others, please?
So I have a different take on this.
Yes, please.
From the standpoint of where GE is with its computerized interpretation of ECGs, it's important that we are in the AI world as a means of understanding the AI world. So the whole idea of explainability. So at GE, we're trying to understand when an algorithm sees something, what is it saying? What are those ECG patterns that other people are having a hard time identifying necessarily? So we are able to do that. The other aspect of it is generalizability. And one of the things that we have looked at is where it cannot be generalized. So it is a good testing mechanism, and as we move forward, we don't think of it as a massive leap into AI. We see it more as a step toward AI. That means hybridizing with existing systems. So that's where we have been looking at AI.
Great, thanks for sharing that with us. Bimo.
In my former life, we used machine learning, which is in the subcategory of AI, for engagement and retention. So for many of you who are involved in remote monitoring, particularly after 30 days and really at 90 days, a lot of these interventions have a huge steep cliff of drop-off of user retention and engagement. And particularly for people with chronic conditions, their conditions don't go away after 90 days. So one of the things that we did when, because we had such a high number of users, we had 10 million of data points, we had medication data, glucose readings, activity data, med data, also nutrition information that people would input. We could phenotype individuals into 24 different categories and then send messages to them based on our understanding of their personality and their preferences. And what we could show is by personalizing content using AI, we'd increase user engagement by 30%. So, for example, in diabetes care, taking a morning glucose reading prior to eating is a really great indication of how you're doing with your 24-hour glucose control. And for someone with who's on insulin, it's a great way to manage and titrate your insulin at the start of the day. And so we found that a simple message for those individuals who are not checking frequently in the morning, of engaging them with the personalized content, of just saying, check in the morning, increased morning checks by 80%, which then translated into improved outcomes in those cohorts that were checking at particular times that we had personalized that content to. So once again, it was aiding in assisting people with engagement and content and education, but not directly influencing interventions or decision support for those individuals or physicians.
Well, that's very interesting. Hold on to that thought, because we're going to get back to it when we talk about outcomes, because you said that it was associated with improved outcomes. I do want to revisit that with you. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, no, actually about heart failure and actually about outcome as well. We've been exploring, this idea about being able to reuse signal physiologic monitoring from cardiac implants in order to really assess, outcome of patients with heart failure, and more specifically, like patient status according to this physiological measure. And this is something the manufacturers did. I mean, HeartLogic is a great example. So at Implicity, we've been trying to really kind of do that on a broader scale for all patients with implants. And what we were able to do is actually to predict, readmission with heart failure, which, allows for specific, like triggering intervention. This is not directly an intervention, but it can help physicians trigger that. But also when you have any kind of physiological status monitoring, you're able to basically come back to the titration GGMT scheme, which is basically you are able to say this patient is stable, so you should be able to intervene, not because something is happening, but because nothing is happening. And actually act on it and say, okay, let's not stay on the same dosage, but let's increase.
Oh, that's a great example. Sandra.
Since you mentioned HeartLogic, I just want to spend a couple minutes on explaining a little bit more. So we have been developing a lot of products for remote patient monitoring, and I agree, it was said before, we are diagnosing, right, and we are not really closing the loop on theranostics piece, which would be exciting, and there is an opportunity there. I just want to point a couple things. So yes, HeartLogic is great, and more of those types of products should be coming forward, and also being, the relevant data being shared with patients and physicians. So HeartLogic is essentially an algorithm that helps us in advance, about a month in advance, predict that somebody is going to be going into cardiac decompensation status. And so it's quite exciting, and exciting that we have really reliable sensors and approaches that we can do that with. But again, I think there's so much work and opportunity to do, and I would just also point out the fact that with the virtual care that has come along in the last few years with COVID, we are generating so much more data, and data that we haven't really known before. And I think that's really the opportunity, and maybe an opportunity to close the loop to getting to theranostics in the future. So that's one of the things that I'm excited about.
Great, thank you for sharing that perspective. Naomi, let me ask you, so like you're very heavily involved in remote monitoring of devices. What are your thoughts, or what's your vision for potentially embedding AI in the remote monitoring of implantable devices? Like, where do you see that being most impactful? Where do you see the opportunities or potentially the hurdles?
We're really excited seeing companies that are developing predictive analytics, using machine learning around ECG pattern recognition, especially when you're looking at silent AFib, and actually being able to predict AFib before it happens and recognize those high-risk patients. And so that's something that we're really kind of setting our sights on, is that ECG pattern recognition, and especially with remote monitoring and all of the data. I mean, obviously we're experiencing that with the millions and millions of ECGs now, especially coming from loop recorders, to be able to truly predict that AFib and hopefully reduce that stroke risk for that patient, get them anticoagulated as soon as possible. And so AFib is really near and dear to our hearts, as well as heart failure that Ardad mentioned as well. So really excited to see where that takes us, and excited to share more about what PaceMate is doing in the future.
Great, thank you, Naomi. From a regulatory perspective, what do you see as things that we, as a scientific community, we need to be cognizant of as we start thinking about integrating AI into remote monitoring, but even taking it a step forward, which is remote interventions?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people here mentioned it, how the patient is kind of getting this information, the patient's being empowered and engaged, but also they're responsible for interpreting a lot of this output and taking the correct action going forward. And so these types of closed loop systems raise the concern that, are you adequately training the patient? Are you adequately communicating with the patient for them to take the right steps? Are you adequately monitoring them afterwards to make sure that it didn't have an unexpected effect? So I think a lot of the things that are coming up with these types of closed loop systems is primarily human factors, usability, and the target patient population too. If this is dependent on cell phones or other devices, what demographic are going to have this available and what won't? So I think there's a lot of new questions that are coming up as a result of this, and I think it's bringing up new questions for us as well.
Great, yes, please.
May I add to that? I think with new technology comes great responsibility, and we need to understand how the patient interface works. Is it an easy one? Is it a difficult one? Is it one aimed to overwhelm the providers? So I think these are questions that we need to ask, and also the transparency in terms of how the algorithms are working. So those are important points, and I think we're talking about lots of data, and there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of opportunity to be overwhelmed. So how that data is presented, I think dashboards, predictive analytics, all of those are important components. But I think that responsibility should be very much recognized, that what we do with this data, how is it secure, how is it safe, and how long should it be stored, and in what form?
Great, yes, please.
I mean, do you really care about the data, right? If you drive your Tesla and put it on autopilot, you really want to see what the Tesla is analyzing. You don't, right? You just trust the engine that's going to go on autopilot. And I think that's what we need to do with healthcare. We cannot have, a deluge of data to providers to make decisions. We just don't have that time and resources. We need AI to help us with that, right? We need hard logic or triage HF or CardioMEMS or whatever data from devices identify a problem, that it needs to go to an algorithm that says you have this medication that you take, that your doctor has prescribed, that goes to Amazon Prime, that delivers the medication to the patient, right? You have the PES dispenser of the blue pill, red pill, and the physician can be informed afterwards what happened, right? But the patient should be closed the loop. We can't have all this data coming to us and have us analyze it and interpret it and act on it.
Great, Sandra, please.
Yeah, I just want to comment. I think I agree. However, I don't want to make it too universal because, I think we need to make sure that the patient closes the loop and they're responsible on that side as well, but we need to validate that they are going to close the loop. And, so as somebody who is really extremely excited about AI, I think there are good uses of AI and not as good uses of AI, and I think we need to really be careful about how we implement slowly and then prove the value, prove that it is going to be the right clinical outcomes that we are achieving, and then, with that said, incredibly excited, but I think we need to be tactical about how we move in that direction.
No, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I completely agree with you. Like, when it comes to these things, you do need the evidence that supports it, right? Before we get too excited about any of these things, AI-aided remote interventions, I think they need to be tested, and even potentially in randomized clinical trials if we can, to prove that they work, and of course taking into account the safety side of things. So thank you for highlighting that. So let's actually get to the next part of the session here, which is basically, now we have a good understanding of what some examples are of AI-aided remote interventions. Will they transform healthcare delivery and outcomes? Because that's the biggest thing. We can all get so excited about the science or the math or how those were built. We're all scientists and we appreciate the beauty of that. But ultimately, we are here to serve patients. We're here to serve the population. What are your thoughts, maybe starting with you and going down here, in terms of, first of all, do we have data that they're transforming care? You mentioned you have some data increasing the use of GDMT, so that's great that we're showing that. I would argue that this is an intermediary endpoint, so to speak. What I want to see is that you are indeed improving survival, reducing heart failure hospitalization, all those kind of hard endpoints, and of course, patient reported outcomes. So if you can just comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great point. So what we do have, we have NT-proBNP and KCCQ values, right? So we embedded KCCQ in EPIC. We have EPIC as EMR, and then we survey the patients, quarterly, and then the same with NT-proBNP. So we see NT-proBNP values dropping, KCCQ going up. So that's still an intermediate outcome. Yeah. But it does predict hospitalizations and survival. But I completely agree, we need hard outcomes, right, to prove that all these interventions are making a difference. And that's one. Second, I think it's financial, right? We have to think about the healthcare system as a whole, not just hospital X or Y. Can we decrease the cost of the healthcare system by, making it more efficient? Because if these interventions mean that you have to hire 20 more nurses for a practice to be able to implement, that's not efficient.
Great, thank you. Please.
Yeah, so I think the way that we're thinking of these AI algorithms in general, and I want to caveat that I think we started with the most serious and most risky with the closed loop intervention driven algorithms, but in general I think we're thinking of it more as a data point to better inform the overall clinical decision making process. Actually, it was a very timely article this week in The Economist talking about how AI is going to transform the revolution in science, and they compared it against all these other breaking or paradigm changing inventions like the internet or other things that delivered on some promises and didn't deliver on the other. But I think one of the quotes that I thought was helpful was Robert Hooke was talking about the use of microscopes and telescopes in transforming science in 1600s, and he said that these are artificial organs that help us to appreciate the natural world better. And I think that's kind of how we're thinking of these algorithms as well. These are providing just a little bit more insight into how to observe the world around us. It's not going to be a complete system. It's not going to be, take the physician out of the picture entirely, but something else for their consideration when they're trying to provide a diagnosis or follow-up or whatever it is for that subject.
Great, please.
So in practice, when I ask someone to take a log of their blood pressure, some patients will do it, some will not. The data is not necessarily robust. We're changing that. We are working with AliveCore to integrate their Cardia's ECG strips into Muse directly. And this would allow patient to control to an extent with physician oversight. We don't want to overburden the physicians in terms of taking charge of their health, of understanding what symptoms entail. Reassurance, because this is not AFib. So the patient becomes more in charge and more empowered to make change. At the session before, Mr. Gale from one of the advocates for patients for AFib mentioned that the triggers for AFib become much more evident when the patient sees it. So I think those are the ways we are putting patient-centered in this truly, in a way that they're advocating for themselves.
Well, what about the potential for these, remote interventions to really transform healthcare delivery and outcomes? Do you see that to be achievable?
I think it's achievable with guidelines and what it really means. Because we could, as I said, we could have a lot of data, but how valuable is that data and how we are tailoring that intervention, how personalized it is, will take time. I don't think we're there, but I think the potential is definitely there.
Great. Naomi.
I listened to an interesting podcast just this week from Mayo about colonoscopy imaging, and they're already using AI to detect polyps. And the average person looking at these images are missing about 20% of polyps. I mean, they're small, it's difficult, and with the addition of AI, that takes that risk down to 3%. And I thought that was pretty impressive, and that was something that already just exciting things are happening, and things are moving faster than they ever have before in this space.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. I hadn't heard of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're hearing a lot of examples of how it aids in diagnostic accuracy. One of the examples I mentioned early on was, in how do you actually enable patient education, understanding the data that's coming in and personalizing content. And I think, Sana, you had alluded for me to unpack that a little bit more, which I'll do right now, which is, it was hard for us to make a direct correlation to outcomes because, once again, we weren't actually asking the patients to make changes to their medications or their physicians. What we were asking them to do was just change behavior. And so the impact of just sending someone a reminder about checking their glucose at a particular point in time or to do it more frequently actually achieved the goal of having people do that. And then through our data, we knew that people who checked more had a more robust reduction in their A1C. And then if you go through and you comb the data further, we could see that their providers had made prescription changes based on that because they had more complete information to better inform decisions. Now, we weren't assisting the provider in any of that. What we were doing was arming the individual with information to take more checks, which then they shared with their provider in a very concise and summarized format that then aided a physician to actually pick up the pen and write a new prescription or change the prescription. So I think we're on this journey of figuring out how do we improve diagnostics, how do we actually improve supporting patients the 99.9% of the time they're not in front of a provider to do those things that we would like them to do, and also give them context behind that. And then you can quickly start to extrapolate, even with the information we have, what that translates into outcomes. But I think we're still a little bit of ways away to the closed loop system for all the reasons that people have mentioned, but that's certainly the holy grail of what we'd like to get to.
Great. Yes, please.
Yeah, I may have an example. I mean, obviously, when we speak about outcome, like what we would like to see is basically, mortality, hospitalization decrease, this kind of thing. And AI really, when it comes to intervention, is usually just some part of the system. It's not everything about the AI. It's about like the whole loop and how it works. So we've been, and even if we have like this kind of system, we struggle to get the data to really analyze the outcome, right? So what we tried to do was having access in France to basically for a single payer system to an exhaustive set of patients across the country of every single patient under remote monitoring or patient with ICDs, try to really re-estimate like the outcome based on is this patient a remote monitoring, is it without it, and when you add a system like implicitly with AI, does it provide a better outcome? So we were able to actually present that result during last HRX. It was done by Neeraj Verma from Cleveland. And what we were able to see out of 70,000 patients is actually retrospectively, so it could be biased, but still a trend of decreased hospitalization, but also decreased mortality. And it doesn't have to be because of AI. It actually may be just because of your saving time through AI of healthcare professional, but the time saved allow them to basically make better their regular job as treating patient, which is what actually decreases mortality. And I think like productivity AI could just bring down and mortality because people regain some time that they don't have in order to just change treatment or do whatever they need to do as healthcare professionals.
I know that's a very good point. Yes, Sandra.
Yeah, I was going to say very similar, so I'm glad you brought it up. I think in going back to colonoscopy efficiencies and better accuracy and outcomes, I think we need to put AI where it makes sense to incorporate AI, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity in if you just think about how many AI-aided products are on the market, of hundreds of them, it's all radiology, right? So just take that out of the playbook and just continue to improve imaging for the physicians. In turn, they're going to be getting faster at their decision making and they're going to get better outcomes. And then the second piece, I would say, I think the experience of the patient and the engagement of the patient is going to be where we should be thinking about incorporating AI, because that will in turn change the outcomes, and maybe it becomes eventually an intervention when the patient just becomes independently making decisions, or that's the holy grail, right? But I think if we play on the experience and engagement, we're going to definitely get there faster with the right AI approaches.
Great. So we have a few questions from the audience. Thank you very much for everyone who submitted a question. So we're starting with the first one. When speaking of AI, what's the greatest single value that it can have for the patient and then for the HCP? Anyone would like to take that?
I would say it personalizes care for them.
Yeah.
It individualizes it.
Yeah.
For the healthcare professional, it's clinical decision support, which is really, really helpful. We're not looking for cognition replacement. We're looking for ways that you can take the data and present it in a manner that the physician can do what they're doing and not waste time doing everything else that they are not, that they didn't train to do. That's the simple response.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And personalization can be with risk stratification,
Right.
with diagnosis, with selecting someone for treatment
Right.
in terms of...
Yeah, and it takes away some of the bias if it's done properly.
Indeed.
Right.
Indeed. Okay, great. Thank you. Next question here is, how would you prioritize getting standard data, terminology, structure, in terms of success for AI-aided remote interventions?
my view is that, I mean, that's the ideal model. We all understand and realize that the real world it's much messier than that. But one of the opportunities for AI is to also put context in and help you take some of that unstructured data or data that may be not as clean or as standardized as other types of data, and manage and interpret those in a way that can go into an algorithm to still be interpreted. So, I think it's still a journey that we have to go on because you have to validate that those algorithms are actually making the correct interpretations. But the real value also in AI is the interpretation of messy or unstructured data, that we can then make some sense of, whether it's for the patient or for the provider.
Anyone would like to add anything?
I would just like to add, I think it's important to remember that the patients are seeing their personalized experience in their real life every day, and they are expecting this, right? And so it's a big opportunity for us to think about how to treat it as, what's the low-hanging fruit where we can actually, and I like that you mentioned, how do we identify the right patients? How do we help with clinical decision support? How do we engage the patient in that clinical decision support, shared decision support, or whatever it is? And AI has little pieces of value there. And I think it's about efficiency, acceleration of workflows, and again, small areas where we can provide a difference, and then it will keep moving in that direction.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
no, maybe an additional piece around that. So the biggest issue with AI is usually considered to be biases, right? I mean, any kind of bias that could be, and this is an issue we can not always be aware of. So I think any kind of initiative that allows to open data, make data available digitally with great quality, but across populations in a more diverse way, help get rid of this kind of bias. And I think HRS actually is quite, undertaking a lot of initiatives around, having manufacturers of sensors speaking with third parties and this kind of thing is actually critical to, and most of the time it goes through nomenclatures and taxonomies and this kind of EHR integration tools. But I think it's still very critical that, let's say, openness of data of quality exists for, additional players to join this research around AI, but also to decrease the potential bias that we're going to meet.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience: how do you increase trust in these technologies to see the benefits realized?
I can start.
Yes, please.
So I think that we struggle with this as well at FDA. And I think one of the things that we're focusing on is as much transparency as possible in terms of, how was the algorithm developed? How was the, what was the composition of the validation study? What is the performance in various subgroups? What is the, what is the expected performance for your patient is basically what we're trying to drill down to. And so I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do to give a better frame of reference for a clinician that wants to use this to assess next steps for their patients, to give them that as a background. So.
Yeah,
Yes.
and very quickly on that. So I think AI comes in different forms, technically speaking. Some of this AI may be under FDA regulation, but in the US, by differentiation to Europe, where most AI is actually under CE marking, US has a more balanced evaluation under AI in healthcare, which can or cannot be under FDA regulation, depending on which kind of technology it uses. So for instance, machine learning is almost always a class 2 plus device under FDA regulation. So I think some of the trust comes from the fact AI is actually often a medical device. And as a medical device, I mean, we have trust issues with medical devices, and that's why FDA exists in the first place, to actually be able to have some kind of certification process. And I think it's important that this exists for AI. So we have some kind of guidance and public statement around what is validated, what is not, and this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else?
I think patient consent is a big part of that in terms of the visibility and the education is really key to what the patient is consenting. So I think not only physician literacy in terms of adoption of technology, but the patient education is a large part of it. And that means all of us need to be informed.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Well said.
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing. I agree with everything that everyone had said. But there's also this notional view that AI is already diffused into our lives today, whether we use Google search, Facebook, and there's an implicit consent that's already happened, right? And so where do we draw the line in healthcare of what's implicit and what do we actually explicitly need? I don't think we've figured that out yet.
No, I think it's a moving target. But I think as this becomes more and more imbued in every aspect of healthcare, I think that those questions will arise. And it depends on the depth, right, of what we are seeking and what we are consenting patients to. So right now, and that sort of leads to databases as well, because there's so much databases that we need. What are people consenting to as part of that process as well?
Yes.
I think just to kind of go further, right, if you saw the recent lawsuit, right, just a few days ago with a company acquiring the data and another company processing the data, right? So it comes across different stakeholders. So who gets the biosensor data or device data, who processes the AI, and then who then implements it, right, across EHR. So I think it's a much larger discussion.
Yeah, and it goes back to the FDA, then who's holding the bag if a bad outcome happens, right? Sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot. No.
All right, great. Please, you had something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, we were talking about improving trust, right? And I think it needs to be mentioned that the type of data and the diversity of data that we collect is going to be the key. So I just wanted to add that too. And I agree with what Rob was saying, absolutely agree that there has to be transparency in how we are developing, and there has to be a collaborative way of developing the products, ideally with patients, physicians, caregivers, and the entire care team involved. And that really will improve. Like we know patients are eager to work with us, right? And so
Great. So let me actually ask you all, if you agree that AI-aided remote interventions will transform healthcare delivery and outcomes, raise your hand. Okay, what about the audience? Do you agree that it will? Okay, some people are undecided, but most people agree. Okay, great. So as we talked about in the opening session, we said this meeting is about solutions. We want to think about solutions. So I would love to hear from each of you regarding the roadmap. If we were to come together and say we're going to have a roadmap for how to get there, what would be the things that you want to see on that map? What are the necessary ingredients for us to be successful? Any takers?
I think accurate diagnosis and prediction are part of that. And I think that would help with the trust. So the sensitivity and specificity of what AI is doing is really important for us to understand. Mm-hmm. And for it to be for everyone to weigh in and comment on a certain solution. Does it make sense for this? Because there's so many solutions coming our way. And so the idea is that which solution is best. I think those type of conversations we need to have more and more so in the medical community.
And that goes back to the point about the evidence that's needed and making sure that it is good evidence, high quality data. We absolutely need that. So perfect. We have one. I completely agree with that. Others, please.
One thing I would say is interoperability and access.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have to be able to see the data to use the data, and you have to be able to get access to the patients that need it in the more rural populations and diverse populations. And so, big data is everywhere, but you need to get it to the EHR. All of the device data into where it needs to be accessed. Instead of using those small data sets, as a physician, you're able to use that genetic component and data from other patients to specifically treat the patient in front of you.
Indeed, absolutely.
And I think just to add, I think collaboration, right? Because you have so many different companies, and again, you have sensor companies, you have AI companies, you have EHR, you have pharma. So all these need to be integrated, right? Because if each piece does its own thing, but they never talk because of competition, other things, that will never move. And then we need to be able to rapidly deploy if we find the diagnosis that's quick, and then we have a treatment solution paradigm, we need to be deploying it across 100,000 patients in 6 months to see the outcomes. We can't just wait another year and talk about it next year and talk about it next year.
Oh, absolutely. So it's all the different stakeholders that are involved to come together and agree on many of these steps. So thank you for bringing that up. Other points, that's other people.
Yeah, I would like to make the analogy to, I think we did the analogy for self-driving cars. I think that would be in response to the roadmap, right? So we may have an intervention that's really promising, and we may have a ton of data that is going to, or that are going to be telling us, yes, this is the right intervention, and we could pass it through FDA. But I think it's important for us to think about how we are going to make people feel comfortable with accepting that AI-guided intervention. And so, like in my car, I have lane assist, but I have to keep my hands on the wheel, right? And so until it's regulated in such a way, or there's evidence in such a way that I can start taking my hands off the wheel, I think we won't be able to, to be comfortable with it, and that needs to happen if that would be, a piece of the roadmap.
So, Sana, can I play the cynic just for a second? Because everyone, is playing kumbaya, and it's going to be great. But I'd probably also say that, two more recent examples in healthcare that should give us pause to sort of say we really need to be thoughtful about the data inputs and the accuracy and lack of bias in algorithms. Comes from two places, right? So recently, guidelines have changed on how we think about calculating EGFR, right? And thinking about who is eligible for transplant. Huge amount of bias that went into those algorithms, right? And so now we have to roll that back and really reconsider what all of us who are clinicians for the last 20, 30 years have been using as the standard of care. And so how do we avoid that type of problem? The other is, there's probably a dozen different sepsis algorithms out there, and they all have their own intrinsic bias. They work in one system, but they don't translate to another, right? And so we have roadmaps where we have failed in sort of these diagnostic and predictive models in the past. And so how do we use that to inform roadmaps for the future, knowing that these biases and these problems exist, but sometimes they may not come out till much later as well. And so I think there is risk in moving too fast, but there's also just risk in implicitly not doing anything. But how do we ensure that those biases or those problems in these algorithms don't persist, given historically what we've known to have happened?
Excellent point, please.
Yeah, and I just want to bring up, I think that this has a unique space because, and I've heard my FDA colleagues refer to this often, where a heart valve or a much more complex device that takes years and years to develop, it's expected that it would take a difficult trial to run to validate that it has adequate performance, whereas these algorithms can be developed quickly. And I think one of the things that we're faced with is that when sponsors come to us wanting to market their device, they're surprised at the level of information that we're asking for. Find a completely independent data set from multiple sites, having a diverse representation that has, data that can be considered relevant and reliable. It's a steep ask, and it's a difficult trial to run. We realize that, but also I think we're trying to address some of the concerns that are being discussed here.
Let me ask a quick question, if I may, because this is a great discussion, and I agree. A lot of what we're talking about, I see like somewhere in the middle, like in this journey to get to that outcome or to achieve that vision. A lot of it is in the middle. I think at the beginning, like part of it is collaboration, establishing the right relationships, connecting with people, but also part of it is also a needs assessment type of exercise that we have to take, because obviously we can't do that at once in every area. What kind of criteria do you use to decide where do you start? And obviously, in some of you are committed to certain areas based on committees and stuff, but especially like the physicians on the panel, where do we start? Like, there's so much that we can cover, and what criteria do we need to use to say, well, this is a great condition to start with, or these are the great populations to start with? Thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's, in my mind, it's simple, right? You look at the chronic conditions that are highly morbid, highly expensive, right? Heart failure, it's probably the best example. AFib, it's another great example, right? Many patients, we have pretty good guidelines, right? We know how to treat these patients. We have pretty good diagnostics, right? Is that important if your EKG or cardiac detects AFib with 95% accuracy or 98? Probably not, right? I think those are the conditions to start.
Yeah, actually, I kind of differ. I mean, I think it would be actually great to start based on objectives, right? Based on what the needs are, and chronic conditions are obviously like the most important across the ladder. But basically, I have the impression, at least on the industrial part, that you usually start when it's easier and when it's safer. Meaning, when you have data. I mean, when you consider like the short history of machine learning in healthcare, like in the past 10 years, we tend to have a lot of innovation where you have good quality digitalized signal, so across imaging, across ECG, because this is consistently good capture of signal from the patient, and that allows to have a consistent, good quality set of data that you can basically build on, and they may not be like the most obvious, like the highest impact feature, but it's where we start because it allows us to learn and to build. And we should, of course, target what you just said, which are like chronic conditions. And the business, like the fact it needs to be funded, drives us there, obviously, but it's not always where we are able to deliver.
Absolutely. I do want to get to a couple of points before we end the session, but I also want to ask a couple of questions from the audience here. So, how do you use AI to reduce the data deluge problem and show more clinically actionable data to clinicians and avoid showing redundant repetitive alerts?
So I think part of it is understanding the trends and maybe not so much focusing on individual data, but sort of perturbations from those trends and where that is based on the patient's personalized range. So I think from that standpoint, that to me makes a little bit more sense rather than the deluge of data that comes in. So you could have 20 strips sent by the patient, but if AI identifies only the AFib ones or the ones with potential arrhythmia, that's a better arbiter of whether it's arrhythmia or not. And it frees up the physician to focus on the problem rather than all the noise.
Indeed, thank you.
Yeah, and this false positive problem is really, like a very large one. I would come with two very quick examples. One is, you could, what we do, with using this platform. One is we are assessing, based on medication, based on the context of the patient, is it actually meaningful information, meaning AF with anticoagulated patient versus, a new onset of AF with non-anticoagulated patient, high risk, is obviously different because of the context. Another example would be, just back to ECG, would be just reassessing with a new technique the classification, the diagnosis classification of, let's say, an episode coming from an ILR. And we've showed consistently that either Medtronic or other companies like cardiologs or others, and we did as well, you are able to basically decrease by around 80% the level of false positive. And just conveys in more time for physicians and nurses. And in the end of the day, it decreases the deluge of data because of,
Well, thank you. I do want to get to a very interesting and good question, thanks to the person who raised this, which is basically, they said, with the technologies becoming ever more accurate and the amount of the data ever increasing, whose responsibility is it to make sure we're keeping the clinician involved in decision supporting technology and not over relying on what the technology is saying on its screen? Excellent point. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think these technologies are really not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence, right? They should augment the clinician's acumen and the clinician's decision making. And I think the clinicians should be involved when these technologies are being developed rather than just being developed by engineers or other, they should be really involved at the start of the technology.
And that's something actually we covered during the fireside chat session, whoever was able to attend that, in terms of like us, taking control and defining how AI will be used and to what extent and where, like, how far do we go, was basically the question that was raised. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so this goes back to also the data deluge, right? I think AI, especially with the right accuracy, with the right models, a little bit more specific, generative AI can help with the data deluge, right? And so that might be, and I would love for anyone to disagree because we don't know enough, but those types of usages of AI will be important so that we can narrow down and then we can help the physician with their efficiencies. And then at the end of the day, they're always the decision maker.
Indeed, that would be my hope anyway. Please.
Yeah, and I just want to say, when we review these devices, we have an understanding of how they're going to be used when they're rolled out into the field. But I think the best way to ensure that physicians are still informed and still in the loop is and seems funny coming from an FDA person, but please read the labeling. So that's where, that's our opportunity to communicate directly with the person who's going to be using this device. And, we spend a lot of time wordsmithing and working on the nuances so that it can be interpreted as literally as possible. So, I mentioned this yesterday at our other FDA session, but, a lot of clinical groups will do journal clubs. I highly recommend a journal club just looking at the labeling and better understanding how the device is supposed to be used. I think that would be an excellent way of keeping physicians in the loop.
Great. Thank you.
The other thing, and we've seen this in a couple of other platforms, is also letting the physicians get back to the source data, right? So you don't want to necessarily inundate them, but give them the option and the opportunity. I think the example that you gave is, the automated interpretation of a bunch of AFib strips or Holter strips for AFib. Let if they have a question or there's a question about, the diagnostic accuracy, you can always click through and get to that. So I think that would also give, clinicians a lot more comfort to say, in those, cases where they want more information, they can go right back to the source to validate that.
Great, thank you. Another good question from the audience, recognizing how important the collected data are and the quality diversity of the collected data, who is the biggest key player in the data collection strategy, and what should incentivize industry specifically for collecting data?
So I don't have one person, but collectively the medical community, but EMR. So we talk about good data sets, annotated data sets. We all know who are actively in the patient caregiving space that EMR is riddled with false data, with repetitive data, but more than anything, flaws in data. And some of it is data collection. There are biases built in what data input we seek from certain patients and how it's in there. So we need to understand how good that data is before we sort of unleash it. And I think there's some responsibility that comes with cleaning the data, scrubbing it off, and not fully, we can't do that, but understanding the inherent biases that are part of the EMR and of our data collection.
Before actually mentioning these last few questions from the audience, I said I had 2 points, and I think somebody in this audience read my mind because they sent a comment, not a question, that absolutely hits at this one point that I wanted to raise, which is the patient. What is the role of the patient in all of this? And as far as I see it, their input is going to be critical every step of the way, like, at the inception, as we go through it, and then, and that is my second point that I wanted to raise, which is we talked about the start, we talked about the middle, but at the end, like once you have something that's proven, that's high quality, that we know changes outcomes, improves outcomes, how do you improve implementation? And of course, the patient can play a big role there. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the implementation is really engaging the patient, right? I think there's so many studies that show that any patient that's engaged is going to change behavior, is going to change what they do, is going to be more compliant. If they understand why the data is important, they'll collect the data accurately. So I think really engaging the patient.
Other thoughts, please.
I was going to just add on, trust and confidence, right? And the last piece, a relationship with that individual. It's the last mile problem in healthcare, right? So we can have the best technology, the best diagnostics, the best remote monitoring wearables, but at the end of the day, if you cannot get an individual to trust the information that you're providing to them, it's all for a lost cause.
Thank you. Other perspectives? Other points in terms of the patient, and also like thinking of the diversity, the hurdles some of these patients may have to get engaged or even to reap the benefits. We talked about bias and racism and all of that. Thoughts on that?
But also connectivity. Do we have equity when it comes to connectivity? Broadband, cellular, are these things available? So when we implement these things, are we leaving out big swaths of our population? Depending on which hospital system I worked in Chicago, some of it would be applicable to 90%, and some of it would be applicable to 40%. So I think we need to understand that, and to how do we resource those things so that everyone is engaged.
Great. Yes, Naomi.
We may have said already patient education, but making sure they have a reason to stay connected. And when they have that remote monitor for that device, taking it home and keeping it plugged in, and they understand the reason. We haven't really talked about the cost, but the reason for the cost, and that comes to education and making sure we're including them in that collaboration, and that they feel like they have that accountability to stay connected and to come to their appointments, be involved in their care.
Great. Well, thank you. We have a few minutes remaining, and what I'm hoping to do with the remaining time is go around and just ask each of you to tell me what is one thing you want this audience to leave the meeting with. Any thought, any idea, any perhaps something that you want them to get excited about. What do you want them to leave this session with? Anyone. I'm not going to keep putting you on the spot. I'll give you a break.
Here, I can start.
Yes.
And I'll just repeat what I said earlier, too, about read the labeling. These are very complex devices. We don't expect these to be plug and play. The better you can understand how they're supposed to be used and that you're using them in accordance with how they were validated, I think the better it is that you're going to be providing care for your patient. And I think more than that, I think just know that at FDA we are trying our best to make sure that these are validated as thoroughly as possible in diverse populations, and communicating that in a transparent way so that you can make better decisions. So.
Great.
Yeah, I would second that, and I would say, we said that there could be trust issues, but at some point we need to be, as healthcare professional, able to, read the material that is there, access the evidence. When we choose a solution, there will be accessible information about, is it something FDA cleared? Is it something that had some publication available? What is the evidence that is available? And it takes time. Sometimes it's easier to just, go for it or choose based on other criteria. But we actually always, as physicians or healthcare professionals, check that data for drug, for other kind of therapies. So there is no reason that we change our gold standard for choice when it comes to AI or any kind of digital really tool for that matter.
I see it as a relay race with the tech company first, the patient second. They're the early adopters compared to the medical community at large. They're pushing us. So we have to take the baton and run with it responsibly. So I think that is one of those things that it's happening. Patients are embracing it faster than we are, and we need to be sort of the responsible party in helping them with this adoption and knowing what the pitfalls are and what the gains are.
Great. Please.
I can go next.
Yes.
So I think build close to the patient, be ready, because we have so many problems to solve, and it's important to build fast, obviously with the right regulation and everything in mind, but build close to the patient, build lean, and then you will understand exactly what works, and then be ready to pivot often, just like we always build user-centered, and I think it will be better because it's a new area, it's AI, so we need to be careful as well.
Great. Bimo.
My excitement's more near field in terms of I think it's going to reduce the administrative burden of the data deluge on physicians. And so, my hope is through that you get better diagnostic accuracy. You bring a little bit back the joy of practicing medicine because, people see the value and the insights that these algorithms and these tools are bringing to bear in their day-to-day practice.
I'm hearing a similar theme, and it's patient-centric, and I love that. I mean, that's why we all became healthcare providers, nurses, and physicians, and I think it's going to allow us to be more creative. And I think that AI is not going to replace doctors and nurses, but I think that doctors who use AI are going to replace doctors who do not.
That's a good way of putting it. Thank you, Naomi.
And
Yes.
I would say, finding the common ground for cross-collaboration between medical centers, EMRs, tech companies, patients, physicians, right? Because that's the only way to move fast forward. I disagree to move slow. I think we've been moving slow for 10 years. I think we need to move fast, but find the right way to move fast.
Great. Oh, well, many thanks to our panelists. Let's give them a round of applause, please. And many thanks to the audience for your excellent questions and for your engagement, and enjoy the rest of the meeting.